Hey everyone, James from TeaDB here. Today I wanted to bring on another Wistaria tea that I bought during the sale, just before the sale ran out at the end of June. So bringing this out just before the end of June, filming this on June 12th, I think. So hope everyone's doing alright, drinking lots of tea. If you are still sort of locked down and not going to work or anything like that, enjoying that work from home life if you're doing that. Today I am going to talk about the 2003 Wistaria Zipin, but before I do that, I'm going to talk a little bit about a category that I think is sort of a subcategory of tea that doesn't get talked about too much, but I think is definitely worth trying if you can. For instance, this tea. And that is sort of these old school traditional Yiwu teas. So I think a lot of people's exposure to Yiwu teas comes in the form of boutique teas, and these are things like just 2017, 2018 Yiwus produced by vendors that we all know and we all enjoy, and I think those teas are well worth trying. I don't think there's anything wrong with those teas from vendors like White Tea, even on sourcing, Crimson Lotus tea, etc., etc. There's a lot of Yiwu tea. It's not an inexpensive tea, but there are a lot of them available. There are some cheaper ones, there are some really nice fancier ones, but it has a heavy association with sort of being a very boutique tea, especially in the Western market, and it tends to be processed as such. And it's a tea that's I enjoy it aged, but I do think it tends to be a very approachable tea when young. If I were forced to drink young Pu'erh, which is something I don't do regularly, I would definitely choose a Yiwu tea if I was picking. But in 2003, when this tea was made, boutique tea wasn't really like the boutique tea that we think of it today. So this was made again in 2003. It's a Yiwu tea. It's called Zipin. It's got a purple wrapper. The Z stands for that. You can find a lot of tasting notes out there, actually, and I do recommend people check those out. From people like Marshaln, who usually doesn't do a lot of tasting notes, talks positively about this tea. There's sort of a big Wistaria test going on in that 2013-2014 range with Origin tea. So you can find some of those notes out there on TeaChat and other places like that, some of the blogs. But I think one thing that's quite apparent to me about this tea is that it's very different from the boutique Yiwus that are produced more commonly these days. I would even go as far to say that it's somewhat different from even things like the Yongqing Hao Yiwus of the mid-2000s that came just a little bit later, or the Shiza Hao Yiwus that came 2007, 2008 range, and so on and so forth. It has what I would describe as a little bit more of a classical, old school edge to it, and you can find this sort of in one example I would cite is the Naked Yiwu from Teas We Like, that Teas We Like sells rather. They have that tea that's kind of in a similar age range to this and has a lot of these atypical characteristics that we don't really associate with teas. It's heavier on the resin. It tastes more factory-ish in a way. It's less emphasized on sort of these like soft, elegant, sweet flavors. And these teas don't totally depart from that, but it is, I would argue, inherently different character to it. And it sort of plays a little bit against type. For instance, in this tea, you can get sort of like hints of smoke. I think if you had this tea, so part of the reason, one thing you could say is these teas are different because this tea is now 17 years old. It's a 17-year-old Yiwu, and we're trying these teas that are very young. And that is true, but I would argue that if you were to taste this tea back in 2003 or 2004, it would probably taste extremely different from the Yiwu that we're drinking now that's 0 to 2 years old as well. And I think you can taste hints of that when you do drink this. So I think it's a really interesting drink just in terms of education and just learning. I also think it's a really good tea. I think it's aged well, and I probably think it will continue to age well as most of Wistaria tea does. These are just well-made teas. by a guy that knows what he's doing, in Yiwu. So this tea is not cheap now. It has sort of edged up in price over the years. I calculated, I think, after the sales price, it's around 67 cents a gram. So we're talking about 65 to 70 cents a gram. So not cheap by any means, but for a session like this where I'm using a little bit under 6 grams, it's like we're talking about $4 to $5. So still, in my opinion, a pretty reasonable thing to try. Certainly not going to totally bankrupt you by having a session if you can split up a cake or something like that. Yeah, so gonna get into drinking this a little bit more here. One last note that I have here is also I split a cake of this. I didn't buy more than the half cake of this 2003 Zipin with Garrett, and we also split a cake of the Hongyan, but I also bought a few extra Hongyans. The compression of the Hongyan is notably a lot looser than this tea. This tea is really quite tightly packed in. So that was another interesting thing that I noted. I've noticed a couple vendors in more recent times have also kind of gone through a similar trajectory. White Tea notably presses the tea. I haven't tried it in the last year or two, but they press the tea quite a bit harder than they did, or quite a bit tighter than they did originally. So, or I guess they did the reverse trend of this, where they started to do it. So it's interesting to see vendors make these adjustments. I don't have incredible insight into why that was. The Hongyan is not an incredibly loosely pressed cake, but this one's pretty tight. And in that sense, it also reminds me a little bit of these older school teas. Yeah. Anyways, going to get into the tea now. So, of course, Wistaria Tea House is based in Taipei, and I talked a little bit about that in the last episode with the Hongyan, so definitely check that episode out if you're sort of curious more in Wistaria Tea House. And it's a really unique place, really cool place to go visit. Definitely one of the first places I recommend for anyone even slightly into tea to check out in Taiwan. So anyways, I have steep number 2 and 3 I just made here. So one thing that I smelled, especially after the first steep, that's a little bit less present now, is it sort of had a really strong hay and like sort of hints of smoke. Sort of getting sort of those sweet, piney hay flavors here. I would say the aroma has changed too. A pretty aromatic tea overall. Recently shipped from there, so I've had this lying around for maybe a month or so. And I've had it probably 4 or 5 times, and I've enjoyed it just about every time I've had it. There is a little bit of inconsistency here or there, but that's nothing unusual for Pu'erh. Cheers. Very sweet in this session, sort of like this sweet menthol pine thing going on. Sometimes I get sort of this powdery texture. I get a little bit sort of in the mid-taste of this, but it's not as prominent as it has been in some other sessions. The core of it is somewhat soft. Definitely tastes some of those more hay flavors, stuff like that. It also has more of a resinous content that I think, to me, signifies more of that old school nature. I think some of these newer Yiwus taste so refined that even just having a little bit of that texture would be even considered to be somewhat unusual. And you can find a little bit of that in some of these earlier Yiwus made by places like Chenyu and Hao. Less so Yongqing Hao, but maybe depending on the production. But for this tea, really front and center to it. Good depth, just a lot of sweetness all around. This steep, not too bitter. This one is brewing slightly darker. I think I may have slightly underbrewed it here, so probably in the later steeps I'll extend that steep time a little bit. Used to getting a little bit of a darker reddish color to the tea. Yeah, it sort of has this really nice sweetness to it. It's not exactly fruit, maybe a little more woody, I guess. Now we sit and sort of enjoy that aftertaste. Really good aftertaste at top of the mouth, or back of the mouth and top of the throat. One of those teas where I'll probably drink water afterwards and it'll be sweet. Cheers. Right, so this steep's a little more fuller bodied to it, a little more of that hints of smoked wood, maybe a little stronger in the resiny characteristics, a little bit less sweet, but still pretty sweet. I think probably the lack of sweetness here in the initial taste is just a factor of the strength of the brew, and the aftertaste will probably be even stronger. Smooth texture overall. It's not like smooth like a ripe pu'erh, but probably smooth relatively as far as raw pu'erh goes. This is 17 years old and has had probably pretty middle of the road either Taiwanese or Hong Kong storage. Definitely not dank by any means, so if you're concerned with that, I wouldn't be too worried. Yeah, so really approachable tea on this brew. It sort of coats your mouth and the top of your throat. To me, this tea is definitely at least a half step up from the Hongyan, which I also enjoy, but I think I'm buying more on the sense of potential for the future as well. Whereas this tea, I really enjoy this now. I think, so going to give this a 7.3 rating, which is pretty high. That's definitely higher than some of the other ones. I do, so one of the other teas I mentioned earlier in the episode was the Naked Yiwu, which is another one I recommend you check out if you are curious about this one. I think that one maybe even a little bit more old school than this and hammers in those characteristics. Part of that could be a little bit of the storage, which has really maintained some of those. If you had both of these teas in storages, I don't know if they would how they would compare exactly. So that tea I gave a 6.3 rating to. So this is a full number ahead of that. That tea worth checking out. This tea I'd say is definitely a grade above. As far as like the value over the average tea owned, and so this is a metric that's irregardless of cost. I would say probably around plus 1.7. Definitely better than a huge chunk of the teas I own. Definitely also more expensive, which would mean like the value over the replacement level tea, or compared with like the average pu'erh I would buy, I'd probably give that a 1 in the 65 to 70 cents a gram range. I don't buy a ton of teas from that range, frankly, just because it's starting to get a little bit more expensive, and when I do, sometimes it's like a cake split or something just a little bit more moderate for me to drink through rather than a bunch for me to sort of set aside. And I think it compares pretty well with Yongqing Hao and the prices that those teas cost these days, just because those tend to be quite expensive compared to what they used to be even just a few years ago. So yeah, I think that makes this a pretty attractive buy. I think it's definitely worth trying if you haven't tried an old school Yiwu before, if you're curious. Other options to check out could be some older Dai Yiwus, which tend to be have a little bit different characteristics than boutique Yiwus as well. Definitely something probably pre-2005 is probably what I would recommend. So I hope you all enjoyed this episode. Hope you learned something. Let me know how you liked it. Let me know if you've tried this tea and how you like it. I think it is probably close to my favorite tea from Wistaria. So yeah, I will see y'all soon. Cheers.